Welcome to the Sheth Leadership Academy Lecture Series, a series of presentations delivered by Professor Jagdish Sheth, author of hundreds of research papers and marketing and management books such as The Rule of Three and Clients for Life. This lecture focuses on developing company culture and is titled How to Implement Customer Centricity.
Customer centricity has become almost the obsession of corporations. But we have more failures than successes, especially in a business-to-business marketing. Companies that have gone from product-centric or engineering-centric culture to customer-centric culture have failed. Examples include Lucent Technologies, it includes Nortel, and only a few companies have been able to successfully transform or transition from an engineering-driven, a technology-driven company to a customer-driven company. Obviously, the best example is IBM, which was almost collapsing, turned around by taking customer centricity and organizing themselves accordingly. So what lessons can we learn from other companies who have made this journey a successful journey? In many ways, it may sound like such a short journey, such obvious things to do, like going from the Napa Valley to Silicon Valley, 50-60 miles apart physically, but those are two different cultures. In the Napa culture, you never do before it's time and you define the time. In Silicon Valley, you are running harder and harder. And just as very hard to go from the Napa Valley culture to Silicon Valley culture, it is equally hard to go from a product-centric company to a customer-centric company by and large. So this is the lecture that tries to synthesize the knowledge that we have out there into a framework. Before we get into how to implement and what companies have done, why customer centricity is becoming a necessity, not just a nice thing to do. During the boom time periods, there is always a demand exceeding the supply. You have no excess capacity, no inventory, and therefore you can afford to be a product-centric company. So one of the key reasons why customer centricity is becoming a necessity is the great economic recession of 2008 to 2010. We haven't even recovered fully yet in the US, and now Europe is in recession. Before that one, Japan was in recession. Other than emerging markets, especially China, and to some extent, let's say India, Brazil, and other countries, the world economy is flat. It's just not growing. That means you have a very intense competition. Everybody's trying to get their own share of the piece of the pie rather than growing the total pie. So economic recession has brought the necessity to be a customer-centric organization. At the same time, competition is expanding. Market is not expanding. Competition is expanding because not only do we have to compete with other multinationals from advanced economies, such as, for example, General Electric competing with Siemens on the one hand and maybe Mitsubishi on the other hand, or whatever they are, but now we see the rise of multinationals from emerging economies. So in the steel industry, in the aluminum industry, in the auto industry, you see enormously, definitely in the appliance industry, you see enormous competition on a global basis arising from emerging multinationals from emerging economies. So market is flat, competition is growing. The third one is a very unique issue. Surprisingly, because of the economic recession, companies have really reduced capital spending, especially on the R&D. Just the time when you need innovation to grow the markets, we don't have the money. Government spending on R&D, which is a big actually investor in R&D, don't have the budgets. Whether it's the military R&D or it's a civilian R&D or a space like a NASA program, and space programs every nation that has, like European space program, Chinese space program, Indian space program, there's a huge struggle how to invest into the future technologies and create brand new breakthrough knowledges. It's just very limited money as a percent of the revenue or GDP. And the last one and very important one criterion is that more and more companies are finding, especially in a business to business or industrial marketing, that we need to be selective about customers. You know, at one time the norm was that if somebody says, I want to be a customer, we welcome them with open arms. We said, welcome. In ad agency business, we often joke about if the customer says jump, we say how high, rather than raising the question, why should I jump even, right? I think now companies under tough times are saying, do we have to serve all the customers? Or can we be more selective, and therefore what is the process of selecting out customers or selecting in customers? So the key strategic advantage, as I have pointed out in other lectures, is that generally customer selectivity, customer centricity is very important because the revenue per customer and the cost to serve the customer are out of alignment. So if you look at the plot where on the x-axis we have plotted from the largest revenue generating account or a customer to the smallest one on, like heavy users to casual or occasional users, for example. Vertical axis is the revenue. You can see the revenue curve, highly exponential, or Pareto's curve, and we call it 20/80 ratio. However, we have just learning to allocate costs around customers. So one of the key implementation strategy in a customer-centric organization is change in the accounting procedure. Our accounting came from the industrial age. Everything was organized around cost accounting from a production manufacturing viewpoint. Accounting reporting, even for financial purposes, is the same way. So here one has to invent a new accounting procedure such as activity-based costing and allocate the same costs around each account or each customer. And when you do that kind of an allocation, surprisingly the cost curve does not follow the revenue curve, which says we have a very large customers where we are making no money whatsoever, and we are subsidizing them by a handful of customers where we have a very high margin or high profitability. If I was a competitor, where do you think I will attack you? I will definitely attack you, especially in areas where you have the highest profitability, highest margin, and a very simple tactic I can use is to offer a comparable product but at a lower price. And if your customers on the left side of the chart are primarily traders, middlemen, distributors, it is even an easier sale because there is no emotion of consumption among the middlemen. I've done a lot of work with companies. In professional services, one of the accounting firms who sell activity-based costing to their clients but never used it themselves, over 4,000 clients, when they allocated the cost, I was just an advisor, lo and behold, they were profitable in only 400 accounts out of 4,000. That means only 10%. The rest of them, they were unprofitable. This was the audit side of the company. And of course, they were giving away everything free. Ad agencies have the same problem. IT services have the same problem. In manufacturing products, the same problem. It goes across all industries. And therefore, either one has to do the cost realignment around revenues, or one has to have a customer selectivity. This is a key chart. I know that the actual data, when you look at it, sometimes the biggest top 4 or 5 customers are not as profitable or not profitable, and that's not because the theory is wrong, but because the salespeople usually surrender the profitability or the margin to the customers if they are very powerful big customers, especially OEM customers where you are a supplier, or especially when you are dealing with very large, highly competent, technically savvy industrial buyers. So it's very important to understand that it is not the theory, but it is the practice that is in violation of what one should be able to look into this chart. So why is it so difficult to implement customer centricity? I try to analyze this thing. And I found that companies which are primarily product-centric culture, which is how most companies begin, with all the competition and the growth of competition from emerging economies who tend to have a cost advantage and therefore a price advantage, if you continue staying as product-centric, you go downward spiral as a status quo management. And sometimes you try to manage in the short term by cost reduction, as we have seen in the last 2-3 years after the great economic recession, or we saw the same thing in the 80s after the first energy crisis, that the industries were totally restructured. We invented concepts like re-engineering the corporation, downsizing, right-sizing, outsourcing, all those buzzwords we created. We are implementing the same now after the great economic recession. Problem is that it's a short-term survival game. It is not a sustainable long-term unless you do the cost reduction and you want to exit, just for example, as a Firestone did in the 80s in the passenger tire business, where they couldn't survive, shut the factories one after the other, got even a major cost cutter from outside to execute fast, and ultimately they ended up selling Firestone to Bridgestone, which is a Japanese tire maker. Same thing happened in fact to BF Goodrich and Uniroyal. They even combined combined together to survive, couldn't survive, and ultimately ended up selling to Michelin, for example. In the 80s, we saw so much of restructuring. Private equities came in because the only people who want to buy immediately are the private equity people, and if you have not done your cost reduction, they know how to do it, and then they sell the company. Private equity is back again, just like in the 80s, in a very big way, because the world is stagnating and costs are still constant. So cost reduction is a short-term survival strategy, but if you really wanted to sustain and wanted to grow the business, customer-centric culture becomes very key. Sounds obvious. You can get more out of an existing customer than acquire a new customer. And it's very possible because an oil well where you have successfully drilled oil is always having more oil than try to figure out a new and explore a new oil well. I know in gift giving, in donations, this is a rule, cardinal rule about going after the same donors again and again rather than trying to get a new donor. Same thinking around here. So it's such an obvious thing to go from a product-centric to a customer-centric culture. Why it is not done? And the problem is that we get 5 major constraints that come in. The culture mindset is all about product, technology, and they're changing that. Processes, systems, the way we are organized, usually we are organized around products, P&L, or profit and loss, and often the policy, regulation that comes in the way. So the role of management is transformative change, and that can only happen with a strong intervention by management to reorganize the company from a product-centric to a customer-centric culture. So how do we do it? There are 9 different initiatives I have identified, and I can put them together. It is in a pie chart, as you can see. The first and the most critical, my view, is that appoint a chief customer officer, not a chief marketing officer, because that word marketing means you're going to be a sales support in a B2B environment, and marketing means you will be a brand manager in the consumer markets. It's same old stuff. So you have to create a new label, new language called Chief Customer Officer. Chief Customer Officer is a staff function at a corporate level. If it's a conglomerate, then at a group corporate level. Very similar to HR function, very similar to finance function, and of course more recently the IT function. The Chief Customer Officer reports or must report directly to the CEO. That's another very key responsibility. And he or she should be responsible for all key accounts, which means all customer accounts are into 2 categories: those which are key accounts where you have dedicated resources you commit, and those which are pretty much transactional driven and could be served through intermediaries like distributors, dealers, whatever it is. Key accounts have to be at a corporate level because you have so many different product lines that you can all offer to the same account. I remember at 3M company, which is very much a product-centric divisions, when they put this corporate responsibility of key account management, the largest account that came was, I think, General Services Administration, GSA, of the government, and they bought thousands of products from different divisions, and nobody in the audience knew who was their largest single customer because they thought about product orientation. Fascinating. So this is to create a customer-centric culture. We brought the CEO of the company and say, I'm your largest customer, do you know who I am, like a mystery guest or a mystery shopper. Same thing happened at Procter & Gamble. Product-centric organization. Out of nowhere, Walmart had become their largest customer, and Walmart was not happy because each product-centric organization or a division, such as a detergent division, the coffee division, whatever they sell, had their own processes, had their own culture, had their own systems, had their own billing, collection, delivery, and of course they were incompatible with what Walmart wanted. So you can create, and this Chief Customer Officer should be in charge of global branding of the company or the products even for that matter, and marketing. It is analog position to a brand management function, except it's a corporate staff function as opposed to a line function by and large. Second, my recommendation is to create a customer-centric cross-functional alignment. All the functions to run a business generally are organized around the product. So in a typical supplier-customer relationship, salespeople are in charge of the customers and not anybody else. Customer support are in charge of the users after the sale. If the company has any problem, such as IT services at my university, for example, if I have as user problem, I go to my IT department who calls up the vendor and says, we are having problem with your hardware, software. or if it is a data company like SAS, which mines data, for example, a large scale data, then they call them up to fix the problem. So the supplier has a sales knowledge about the customer or the procurement knowledge, and the service department has the user knowledge, but they don't connect. And there are lots of other functions like the legal function, the HR function, the IT function, which are in the sideline sitting in the back. The idea is that rather than that bow tie of the connectivity, if you want to be customer centric, you must reverse that bow tie. The first one looks like when you want to close the elevator doors. Remember, you press that button which says you are closing it. Second one says you are opening the door, which is a very key one. So what you do is you reorganize where all of the functions are organized around an account, and customer must also reorganize their support functions, their functions into an alignment. So you can see IT department of the supplier company begins to directly work with the IT department of the customer company, because IT to IT you have to relate. The finance department, the legal department, etc. You can read the whole laundry list. And then the role in the middle is that of an account manager. Key account manager is one of coordination, to coordinate all of the functional resources dedicated to that particular account. This is a very key approach to aligning the functions so that we have less friction within the organization. The third major recommendation for companies to make this transition successfully has been having the deployment of IT technology. Most companies, unfortunately, remain very legacy in their computerization. So how do you create what I call a connected enterprise? That means go from a functional silos to an integrated organization, and go from a time silo to more and more online. And today, with definitely the internet-based, web-based applications, things are all more and more online, which says you can connect with the customer on a 24/7 basis for everything you do. So that is necessary. So traditional enterprise usually has functional silos and time silos, geography silos by the territory. This says those silos are all gone because IT as an enabler is able to reduce that and create a connected enterprise. So everybody knows at the same time what is happening. How does the evolution take place? From an IT perspective, I have some older paper that I have found the framework most useful. You need to do two things. One is you need to automate and you need to integrate. So most companies began automating in the 80s the back office operations, and it's all internal integration, cross-functional, by putting into the business what we call ERP systems, enterprise resource planning systems. And there are so many ERP systems. Of course, SAP is one of the better known ones, but you have the Oracle system and you have the IBM systems, whatever they are. Then typically the CIO would recommend that you integrate now your suppliers, because you have the power over suppliers to say your architecture has to be the same as mine, as Walmart insisted among all their vendors that yours IT must be compatible with our IT. That is happening. Cisco Systems has done the other way around, where they have made their organization compatible with their customers. So most of the orders come online, as does for Dell, as does for many companies now. Amazon is a classic case where everything is only online ordering, and then everything workflows. So supply chain becomes very key. So you have a supply chain management automation and integration. Then you go toward the customer facing side, which is called CRM systems, and then ultimately everything is connected both outside and inside with the customer especially, and we call it as e-commerce or e-business by and large. I think most companies underestimate how much investment they will have to continuously make in IT support within the organization. Massive. It's not just the capital dollars, but also upgrade maintenance dollars. And I have seen most companies underestimate the amount of money they need to allocate. They think about allocating dollars for capital dollars into factories. But today, in the airline business or in financial services like brokerage business, you can't even survive without the IT doing everything, integrating everything, all the transactions and everything. The next recommendation is to create a dual profit and loss accounting, because historically we are organized, and from a stock market viewpoint we are responsible to still deliver product-centric profitability accounting. What one has to do is to put a matrix now for managerial purposes. While we have publicly reported accounting or financial accounting is done around products, but one can also create a customer by customer profitability analysis. And And of course, you have all the key accounts where you have the information, but it's the mindset that's very important. This dual P&L, to say a chief customer officer is also a P&L responsibility, as I mentioned, closer to the brand management, where he or she may not have too many people reporting to him, but with the budget of each account, he can or she can actually gain resources within the company from different functions into a dedicated team to focus on an account. I mean, at Procter & Gamble, this is done for Walmart, for example, and I'm told they have more than 300 full-time employees totally dedicated to Walmart account. They actually work and live with Walmart facilities by and large, and now Walmart also has committed to its key strategic supplier called Procter & Gamble, maybe about 150 full-time employees who are all at P&G facilities by and large. It's like a virtual integration, as I will talk about later on. So dual P&L accounting is a second, and I would say probably one of the most critical areas. Next recommendation, to create a customer-centric culture or organization, or to implement customer centricity, is demand-driven operations. IT, if you organize well, should now say, rather than a product and a supply-driven processes, everything works with the order that comes in. And as I mentioned, Dell Computers, Cisco Systems, Amazon, I mean today everybody, airlines, everything begins when the customer places the order. And everything is now supply chain in the back pretty much. So demand-driven supply chain is a very key concept, which means marketing is really reverse marketing now. And marketing means managing supply chain efficiently. Requires, therefore, partnering with your key supplier, whether those are logistics suppliers or manufacturing suppliers, whoever they are, raw material, component suppliers. Requires also partnering with channels if you have channels in the middle. And learning from services industries, especially from airlines and online retailing, is an ideal thing to do. So for example, Amazon, Delta Airlines, these are pretty good examples from services sector that a manufacturing company or a product company can emulate. Next recommendation is to become a capability organization. This is to really overshadow the product-centric viewpoint, which means it is not what you make, but what your capabilities are. So it is not the end terminal product, but it is the black box, competencies, capabilities. And there's a huge value in terms of getting revenues and margins, etc., if you think from that viewpoint, because if you made a product, let's say you made a transformer, you make an engine for the aircraft, you have lots of knowledge how the engine, the transformer will work after it's installed. And of course, if you're a market leader, a legacy company like a Caterpillar, for example, or a company like a Siemens, for example, doesn't make any difference. The biggest opportunity is your install base, not new sales. New sales maybe 5-10%, install base is 80-90%, and there's a lot of opportunity for downstreaming revenues. So in printers, it is not the printers, but the usage of cartridge, and you understand therefore cartridge business, and you supply cartridge. We have done a lot of work in this area, so it's very obvious when you think through. Also, at the same time, to make it demand-driven, one needs to innovate in the core product. We all know about disruptive competition, disruptive innovation, for example. So how do you create yourself a migration strategy where you migrate the customer from the current install base to the newer technology? IBM has done a wonderful job over the years called migration strategy. The defense contractors have done quite a lot, for example, in one generation of aircrafts to next generation of aircrafts. For the military, same thing happens with the civilian passenger airlines, for example. The latest one by Boeing is a Dreamliner called 787. The way they manufacture, the way the airlines will have to actually deploy that, all that is brand new innovation in your core product. Third area is solution capability, which means that if I cannot do everything, if I have a solution mindset by putting yourself in the customer's shoes, I can source other elements that I don't want to make. My job is integrating. I'm like a general contractor. I don't have to be a plumber and an electrician and all this stuff. I can hire them, but my job is to put it together. That's basically a solution capability. And the last one is, and one that is becoming more popular, is that rather than selling capital capital goods, which has all the debates about capital dollar allocation under tough times, and therefore customer is postponing the purchase. He wants to still keep the old factory going because he has no money to revitalize or invest or whatever it is. One thinks about what is called the annuity model of revenue. So IT companies, computer companies, server companies have figured out rather than sell, we can just rent it on a monthly basis, utility model as it is called, or it is basically called selling software as a service, for example. There are a bunch of buzzwords that we have used. So IT as a utility like electricity, like gas, like telephone is a very key concept in terms of creating that. Next. And this is my favorite. We talked about customer selectivity, remember? One of the key concepts there is that what do you do about customers who are non-profitable and you don't want to serve them? The standard thinking is that you fire the customer. There are lots of books and articles about firing the customer, but it's not that easy. Often there are regulatory barriers in banking business, in public utility companies. You cannot fire the customer. Also, it creates pretty negative image when you fire customers. Public opinion is against you. In some industries, I have seen the customer say, your brand, your product is my livelihood. If you don't serve me, you destroy my livelihood, so I'm going to go to courts and I will have a litigation against you. You have to serve me whether you make money or not. Interesting logic, right? So those kinds of things which says there is an option other than firing the customers, which is what I believe very strongly is outsourcing the customers, which means you systematically take a group of customers and give to a third party who is able to serve and still make money. Just like we do outsourcing of HR functions, outsourcing in fact of, for example, IT services, outsourcing of some marketing functions, such as market research, for example. Advertising agencies is an outsourced function. One can think about that one to say, neglecting non-profitable customers who are usually called C accounts, A, B, C accounts, is worse than outsourcing them. Outsourcing non-profitable customers is a win-win-win between you, the customer, because he's served better by somebody else than by you, and of course the third party. Outsourcing non-profitable customer also then enables to release your captive resources to deploy for further growth, either into existing bigger accounts or invest into newer accounts, for example. Next one is something we worked at Emory University in our research alignment in the Center for Relationship Marketing with Procter & Gamble and Walmart. The idea was that really, and this is an old idea by DuPont, that as a DuPont as a supplier, if they can put in the shoes of General Motors who buys their paint and chemicals, that what will make General Motors business grow, and therefore we become better suppliers. In the tire business, they supplied nylon, for example. Just goes on. DuPont is an industrial company, but they had the most research on consumers. So it is your customer thinking, depending upon value chain. Ultimate consumer. So DuPont used to do research on households and figure out what is it that the households are looking for, homemakers, in their buying behavior, and use that knowledge to say to their own customer why they can provide in a partnership a better solution for emerging needs. Remember, marketing is all about anticipating future customer needs, wants, resources, and that's what they do. So customer business development is a very different skill set than the traditional selling and marketing. So what we find is that we have capabilities, but those are capabilities of yesterday, product centric. How do we create a customer centric capabilities, which is a customer business development, which says the role of the salesperson is to really understand what happens to your product that you have sold in the customer environment, and if the customer is a reseller in some fashion, then how value it is creating to the end customer. End customer could be internal or it could be an external end customer, right? It means understanding customers' strategic plans also. And more now, customers with their key strategic suppliers are willing to share their long-term plans, 5-year plans, 3-year plans, strategic plans, which means you can deploy your resources on a longer cycle mentally by being customer-centric organization. It also requires collaborative mindset mindset with customers, and this is the biggest challenge I find. Companies just don't have the skill set for collaboration because the DNA is competition, and once you have a competition based DNA, it is very hard to change your DNA. That trusting others, working with others, creating value together, sharing in the value that we create is better model than fighting for my piece of the pie or even crumbs of the pie. In other words, non-zero sum as opposed to a zero-sum game that one plays. It needs strong financial and operational expertise. This is not an easy thing to implement, as FedEx has done with its key accounts by building mini warehouses for them in Memphis, which is their hubbing place. So you don't have to take the product from Seattle by Boeing for a part, bring it to Memphis every day. You just have an inventory and you say to the customer, I will manage your inventory. It is such a preemptive way of doing things that competition cannot even duplicate that. So FedEx has had a huge competitive advantage by thinking from a customer business development, either customer cost reduction, customer growth, whatever it is, and customer is the person that you sell to. It also requires transforming the sales culture of the organization, and I find this is the most difficult part. As I said, salespeople are organized much more hunter mentality, as it is called in the sales literature. How do we create farming mentality, where you nurture, you understand the soil, you understand the climate, you know when to plant, when to harvest, so you have a renewable orders, renewable crops coming in again and again. That mindset is very different and very difficult to implement, but it is necessary. Next area is joint venturing with customers. I've coined this phrase. We have phrase like partnering with customers, relationship management and all that, but I like the word joint venture, either virtual or contractual, because in a joint venture both parties have to commit, whereas in a typical key account management, the supplier puts all the resources behind a customer and the customer can walk away. Where is the customer commitment? It is like making a breakfast of eggs and bacon. Chicken just lays an egg, that's its contribution, but the pig has to commit. So how do you get the commitment from the customer when you are investing enormously in that customer is a very key thing that happens only by thinking and educating and selling the concept of joint venturing with the customer. So Whirlpool has done that very well with Sears, Kenmore brand of appliances. I think it's a 70 or 75-year-old relationship, still intact. Open books on both sides. Fascinating. And more recently, in the last 20-25 years, Walmart and Procter & Gamble relationship is almost like a joint venture. Joint venturing allows a co-creation of value for end users. Ultimate game is that why are we in partnering together? To remove all the friction in the marketplace and create value for the ultimate customers, whoever they are. So customer mindset, as I talked about, whether those are internal users or external customers, such as a manufacturer with a retailer, a manufacturer with a distributor in industrial markets, etc. Strategic partnering for CSR is the next area. In other words, there are common causes out there such as sustainability, such as, for example, environmental degradation, such as, for example, encouraging people to be socially responsible or contributing toward a social well-being, what is called the triple bottom line: profit, planet, and people. Lots of CSR or corporate social responsibility movements are done, but here it says you partner with your customers and suppliers, which is very interesting, for global sustainability initiatives or community initiatives. All of this sounds very obvious after the fact. It's like an aha, sure, it makes sense. And as companies have tried to implement, they've encountered a bunch of challenges. So the next chart talks about what are the issues if you try to implement customer-centric culture you are likely to encounter. The first and the key one is that who owns the relationship? Salespeople are very territorial. How do you therefore organize where salespeople are willing to have a shared ownership of the customer? Not easy at all. I have learned this quite a lot by advising and practicing in companies. Who owns the customer is a major debate and has to be resolved usually from top down. As I said, key accounts ought to be corporate responsibility, not salespeople. Salespeople can do the non-key account side pretty much. So whether it's a staff function or a line function becomes a debate. Often the challenge is internal poor marketing. In transforming a product-centric culture to a customer-centric culture, it requires a lot of internal selling, internal education, internal marketing. And most companies just don't think from that viewpoint. So second major challenge is internal marketing. Third one is ability to hardwire the customer, which basically means customer has resource commitment and there are switching costs they cannot get out too quickly. Whether those are IT platforms, which is the best hardwiring I have seen, or those are payment platforms, or those are basically management teams on both sides, like a joint venture. That's a key one. This requires new way of measuring things. So we need to create new metrics. The traditional accounting metrics or the traditional performance metrics are not enough. It is quite often a challenge to get all the suppliers in line in terms of this reverse marketing, where you have a demand-driven operations. You are wanting to have a customer-centric culture, but your suppliers are unable or unwilling to align accordingly. That's another challenge I've found. And of course, if your customers are global, which is happening more and more, it is even worse, because to put a global footprint, you have to be present globally. And this is where many organizations just run out of capability to have a global presence. Except the customer may need and demand a global account management. General Electric has done that quite often with their suppliers. Walmart may do the same thing with companies like Procter & Gamble to say, we are in China, why don't you show up in China? We have found the same thing between Coca-Cola and McDonald's, which is again one of the best relationships over 40-45 years easily. It is the largest account of Coca-Cola. It's called the fountain side of the business, where if McDonald's is putting new locations in China or in India or in Africa, you gotta be there, and that requires enormous resource redeployment in some fashion or adding deployment. And the last one, and a very interesting one, which I have not done research yet, but I know it is an issue, is that when you have this kind of a lock-in between a customer and you, are you reducing competition, and therefore is antitrust going to come and watch you? Because antitrust role is making sure competition is thriving and there is no collusion of any kind, but this is not a collusion among competitors, that's a price fixing, but this is a collusion or a collaboration between you and the customer, but it stops competition. It's one of those very interesting, what is right to do runs into policies issues. Either you change the policy by lobbying, etc., or you have to somehow learn how to manage within that policy. So let's conclude. Customer centricity is increasingly becoming a necessity for a company's survival and growth. It's not just growth, which is how the focus has been, but it is for survival. As IBM under Lou Gerstner, coming from outside, transformed the company for survival. Creating a customer-centric organization requires a transformation. It's not a minor change, almost non-linear. A transformation leadership in changing the company's culture, processes, systems, and policy. The best way to implement customer centricity is to appoint a chief customer officer and reporting directly to the chairman and the CEO. He or she should be as important as the CFO in the organization or the chief human resource organization. So it's a team of 5 people is necessary, where chief customer officer, chief information technology officer, a CIO as it is called, chief finance officer, chief human resource, all work collectively together under the leadership of a CEO. Without that architecture, I don't think one can implement successfully a customer-centric strategy or a customer-centric culture. It will also require investing in IT systems, as I mentioned earlier, creating a dual P&L accounting system, a managerial accounting system, and a customer-centric cross-functional alignment. Finally, it will require demand-driven operations, a joint venturing mindset for creating value or co-creating value for end users, and maybe partnering for this CSR or public-private initiatives. Some companies are really good at that stuff, and when I understand what they do and I become knowledgeable, I become very appreciative how much dedicated they are in terms of creating a public-private partnership in a consortium of some sort. And I think it's a great thing to do. The biggest challenge, however, are all internal turf wars. In the book that I wrote called Self-Destructive Habits of Good Companies, and the original title was supposed to be The 7 Bad Habits of Good Companies, I found one of the key reasons why successful companies do not survive in the long run is because they have a lot of internal turf wars, and their ability to adapt, willingness to change just doesn't happen because of the turf wars. So it will be require a strong leadership at the top to implement implement customer-centric culture and try to reduce or bypass the friction created by the turf wars.
Thanks for listening to this lecture on how to implement customer centricity with Professor Jagdish Sheth. For more about Professor Sheth and the Sheth Leadership Academy, visit www.shethleadershipacademy.com.